Okay, this presentation is to be the kind of segue or transition, the more official one, from our first unit in the Hypers and Healing, which was all about the nature of and the effects of digital media on society, self, and the arts. And this one is to make a transition, to start to be thinking about and working on knowledge and skills in particular areas that have to do with enhancing workflow, self-representation, documentation, and creative practice. The first stop on this tour is establishing web presence as a key sort of knowledge and skill for the digital era. So, by way of setting this in context, the yellow text there is the first part that we've been dealing with, the sort of nature of digital media, or its ontology, and its impact. And the second part of this sentence here is where we are now beginning to explore in earnest. We're exploring how basic digital tools and processes can be used to enhance workflow, self-representation, documentation, and creative practice. So again, the first stop on that tour, this sort of second part of our overall kind of course mission, I guess you could call it, is to get hands-on knowledge and skill establishing web presence. Okay, so the basic idea here is that maybe the most basic skill and knowledge that we could establish in terms of digital media would be knowing how to establish web presence. So establishing something like what sometimes to me seems like a kind of life on the web, really, is key to enhancing workflow, self-representation, documentation, and creative practices. So in some ways I see this as not so much as a particular sort of skill necessarily, but more like a general shift in beginning to understand how, on an individual basis, we can establish some kind of life on the web or some kind of relationship to the web that allows us to do a number of things. So in some ways, web presence is very basic or very foundational because we'll build other things on that. So we have this idea that web presence is good, web presence is basic. The idea is what kind? It's pretty evident that there are many ways to establish web presence. And so the question is, how do we do that, again, on an individualized basis in a way that works for us in our own workflow, and it also works to have it accomplish the kind of things we want it to accomplish in terms of putting the best possible self-representation on the web and that type of thing. So we have this question, what kind of web presence are we after? And at this point in time, for many people, the types are really basically one and another. Web 1.0 is basically the world of, and this should look familiar, this is sort of like the world of centralized, convergent, mediated, and monologic. This is another way people describe this is kind of like the first generation or first wave of web presence. Looked a lot like personal web pages, and that was pretty much all there was. And very often those pages were static. There was just simply information presented and not a lot of opportunity for visitors, etc., to interact. So this is the nature of Web 2.0, monologic in that sense, that it's not a much of an opportunity to talk back or to respond to websites, but rather just to read them. So monologic, mediated lots of times by companies, but also by individuals, not sort of inviting other people to contribute to their site, but basically to just sort of give the information in a very controlled manner. Centralized, etc. Web 2.0, the more current sort of thinking about the web, is much more along the lines of what we looked at in terms of social organization, of being a kind of distributed, divergent, disintermediated, and dialogic type of understanding of the web, or type of way of being almost on the web. Again, what we're talking about in the way background here is sort of how does one develop an effective and satisfactory sort of life on the web. So these are the two kinds of types of web presence that we're looking at in terms of current understanding and current terminology. So again, Web 1.0 correlates with the old world, the kind of what I mentioned as the factory model world of centralized sort of places where individuals are sort of congregated in these places and very often getting the same message, whether it's a broadcast television or whether it's a kind of standardized lecture course, et cetera, et cetera. So these were sort of characteristic. So again, Web 1.0, that is, correlates pretty well with this sort of picture of old world that was painted in the first part of our course. And sort of an obvious follow-up, the Web 2.0 correlates pretty well with the kind of new world. Again, the 4Ds, the distributed, dialogic, divergent, disintermediated. So Web 2.0 correlates much more with this sort of understanding and also picture or image of how things are organized. But what I'm going to put forward here is that arguably the real new world, or the really new world, is a combination of both. And so we might see, for example, this sort of representation of the old world, the sort of centralized monologic, etc., doesn't disappear from the scene. No way. It's still an important part. That sort of expertly vetted knowledge and all that kind of stuff still matters. It's not like that's all of a sudden out the window. So, but we might see that as we in the really new world, we might see how this type of organization nonetheless plays a different kind of role. It's not the only game in town, in other words. So this is one way to depict it, is sort of putting the kind of old world understanding inside a kind of a different framework, and seeing how both of these actually can work very much hand in hand. So, to make the point another way, I took this little diagram or image and bunked it on this nice image of a well-traveled suitcase. The idea here is that we don't want to lose the sense in which, when we say it's both, the kind of old world and new world, we don't want to lose the sense in which, nonetheless, that connotes, or that points really strongly to the real new world really is new. So there's certain things about it, and I picked the suitcase to kind of illustrate the certain kind of mobility, the certain kind of being unlatched from place and time that commentators have been talking about for an awful long time. But when it comes to actually establishing web presence, this starts to have real implications for how we would develop suitable representations that capture not only the aspects of our own activities that we want to, but also register in a way with our times. So, again, reiterating the same point, that in some ways the digital media doesn't just change things, it also replicates things. And so we have the kind of existence of kind of two worlds, with the kind of old world and the new world, the sort of digital media stuff and the more centralized sort of broadcast media. That's what we have in real life, and that's also what we have online. So in a way, what's replicated is those two structures. There's Web 1.0 that replicates the sort of centralized piece in RL, or real life, and we have Web 2.0 that kind of replicates the more distributed sense of social understanding, a kind of social networking understanding. So it also replicates, but then also, again, to underscore the second point, that it more subtly changes the overall form. So again, we don't lose sight of the fact that there is something new going on here, okay, even if we're combining these two kind of ways of organizing. A kind of side point, which is not particularly very side point, it's pretty much in the main band here, to say that schools in part exist in some ways to help us see these kind of very large pattern things or the very small things. So the kind of big pictures and the details are kind of what schools are about. At least that's one way to think about it. that, for example, for you guys here, the kind of looking at the details of your art specialty area or craft or expression would be one way of actually you come to school to look at details. But then on the other side of your education here, given that it's a liberal arts education as well, you're also, what we're trying to do over here is help you see the kind of big picture. So this is another way to look at it. You could see schools themselves as a kind of technology or apparatus, in a way, a microscope to look at the details and a kind of telescope to see things that are further away. Sometimes those patterns that are right in front of us, we feel them and we know these things are going on, but we can't necessarily put words to them, and therefore can't use them as subject matter, etc. So this is why it starts to matter to us as content producers in the arts. Is we want to understand the sort of big picture, the sort of patterns that we may know at some level, right? Just like that, we know it because we're living it. But in order to use it as subject matter or to fold these understandings into our work, we have to be able to put words to it and that type of thing. So this is just another way to look at the notion of what schools are here for. So the current digital era, whether it's online or sort of comparing, digital and non-digital, or comparing Web 1.0 digital to Web 2.0 digital, is still continues to challenge, I think, our habit of thinking in either or terms. So that would be one of those kind of big picture things, where we want to call attention to the fact that they have the coexistence of these things and the kind of need to integrate them in a fairly up close and personal way when you're making web presence, for example, making a website. That it's helping us or challenging us really to not think in either or terms, but to think in terms of interactive or dynamic kind of blends of different things. One way to describe this, and this is sort of that big picture thing again, is to call it stochastic, S-T-O-C-H-A-S-T-I-C. This is actually a word that comes out of the field of mathematics, but basically, again, there are organizational forms or ways to understand these sort of combinations of things that nonetheless keep the sense of wholeness to them. And stochastic is one of those. It refers to the sort of higher order combining of random and non-random elements. And so the idea of a stochastic whole or stochastic order would be that it's already at the very beginning understood that any kind of order has to it sort of static, monological, etc. elements. Principles is another way to look at those sort of non-random items, but then also some random items, some happenstance, serendipity, chance, etc. So the idea is that we have some ways to begin to think that our web presence can include 1.0 and 2.0, and that doesn't mean we're just sort of doing some kind of zero-sum game of whatever we do on one side takes away from the other side instead of that kind of either-or thing, but rather that we're actually using the sort of interaction between Web 1.0 types of things, personal websites, etc., and Web 2.0 types of things, blogs, wikis, etc. We're using those deliberately to think of them as being in dialogue or interaction. And that's what stochastic allows us to see. It allows us to see that the dialogue between these things is where the real structure is. So as artists, I would say, once again, we're in this kind of mix and match mode. And in terms of establishing one's own web presence, again, some blend of Web 1.0 and 2.0 is likely going to be optimal. So the characteristics of these things and the technologies associated with them. On the Web 1.0 side, the bedrock of this part of the picture is the custom website, the sort of owned and operated by an individual who is sort of controlling the content and distributing it, making it available to the world. So that's the bedrock, and then to look at another aspect of it, it's usually a personal computer that is the sort of technological imprint of Web 1.0. Someone has a personal computer and they make a custom website and they put information about themselves out there on the web for others to access. So that's the basic thing. And this is, again, held together by the centripetal force of me-ness, in a way. So it's kind of organized fairly centrally around the person. It's not necessarily interactive, but that's the kind of organizing principle, in a way, centripetal, which sort of pushes towards the center, that sort of centralized notion. Then when we move over to the Web 2.0 side, we start to see technologies such as blogs, which are really like online diaries in a way, but usually there's a way there for visitors to comment as well. And so it's not just monologic, but it is a lot like a diary. So there are blogs, there are wikis, which allow multiple people to not only post content but also edit it, Wikipedia being the most famous wiki for producing this sort of vast compendium of information that is actually all built by different authors. So the idea is that this is a totally different type of item from a personal website. So Web 2.0 has blogs, wikis, social networking sites such as Facebook and MySpace are all on that side, that Web 2.0 side, because they're not really, they're distributed, right? So they very much have a flavor. They're organized around the distribution of one's friends and sort of acquaintances and groupings and various things like that. So these are all on the Web 2.0 side. And then in the kind of hardware aspect, we might associate Web 2.0 much more with mobile devices. On this side, I would even include, for example, like a laptop as a mobile device, are much more associated with mobile devices than with a kind of personal computer or a desktop sort of computer that a person would set up in a particular place and leave it there. So again, the kind of suitcase metaphor, the kind of mobility aspect of Web 2.0 we might also put into this understanding. And again, another kind of echo of our first unit of study, the Web 2.0 paradigm or model is really totally held together by dialogue. So what would Facebook be without messages, without friends, etc.? So it's very different from being held together by the kind of centralized understanding and sort of portrayal of the self. So this is quite a different model. But again, what we're challenged to do is not so much to pick one, pick door A or door B, but to actually sort of figure out what's the best type of interactive sort of combination of things. What can we construct that captures that sort of interaction in just the optimal way for us? And that capture, whatever that would look like, that would be one's web presence, right? So your identity or presence on the web is really defined by a combination of things. So if you can sort of coordinate these things, I think it's all to the better in terms of establishing a really helpful and dynamic web presence. A kind of interesting side note, there's another point I think that's worth making is that the Web 2.0 in some ways technologically represents a return in a way to a very early phase of networks computing where people refer to the computers themselves, not the servers, but the sort of computers that people would use in their houses, etc., or at their desk at their job as a dumb terminal. This was much, in other words, there wasn't much you could do when you're sitting in front of a computer screen at your office or at home. You could basically just sort of contact the mainframe computer, and that was the sort of the place where all the goodies were, that kind of thing. Well, in some strange kind of way, we went through a phase where computers got more and more powerful, more and more things could be done right on one's own computer, and now there's sort of an echo back to the sort of dumb terminal era where a lot of what we do now on the web is done on servers, right? So when we go to MySpace, that activity there is all sort of resides on the MySpace servers. We don't actually have to download anything or whatnot. So there is a sense in which, and it obviously feeds in with the sort of smaller mobile devices that you can't sort of operate in the kind of Web 2.0 way with a centralized sort of super powerful computer, because you can't move the thing around very easily, even though obviously computing power has gotten much greater, and even as devices have gotten smaller. But still, this is worth thinking about how fairly quickly we can become used to being able to take advantage of the computing power that exists on servers, and so that we can contact the server with a cell phone or with a tiny computer or a desktop or whatever. But there is this kind of historical antecedent for that. So in terms of our look at web presence, we're going to try to come up with some different images of how to sort of portray this sort of blending of Web 1.0 and 2.0. So instead of, in this case, I just kind of ran these two words together instead of putting them separate on either side there, just to think of them in a slightly different way as a kind of antenna or something like that, that are nicely blended and in a kind of interactive kind of space. Or again, this type of image of thinking how we might be able to sort of begin to become comfortable with this sort of blend of 1.0, which I know a lot of us are interested in establishing a nice kind of Web 1.0 presence, with a personal website and information about ourselves, and that's great. And then there's also questions of then how do we also take advantage of these other Web 2.0 aspects, which are very intriguing, of a different nature but not incompatible. So coming up with ways to make both of these things sort of blend or gel, I think is part of what we'll be doing in the web presence part of our course. So to meet our goal of web presence, we need knowledge and skills both in Web 1.0 and in Web 2.0. And we're going to pursue this pretty much in an integrated fashion. We're going to be continuing to learn about how to make web pages and how to make our own sort of personal website. We've just begun that at this point in time, and we'll continue with that, but we'll also be looking at ways then that we can augment and sort of establish a different sort of, again, stochastic kind of web presence or identity by creatively combining Web 1.0 elements with Web 2.0 elements.